The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows across the vicarage garden, where the annual Street Mary's summer fete was proceeding with its customary blend of gentle chaos and determined cheerfulness. White marquees dotted the emerald lawn like benevolent ghosts, their canvas sides stirring in the warm June breeze that carried the mingled scents of freshly cut grass, prize-winning roses, and Mrs. Pemberton's famous cucumber sandwiches. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her wide-brimmed hat and surveyed the familiar scene with quiet satisfaction. She had attended this particular garden party for more years than she cared to count, and it never failed to provide her with what she privately considered the most fascinating entertainment of all, the endless variety of human nature on display. "Such a lovely turnout this year," remarked Mrs. Dolly Bantry, appearing at Miss Marple's elbow with 2 cups of tea, balanced on their saucers, though I must say there does seem to be rather more tension than usual. Miss Marple accepted her tea gratefully and followed her friend's meaningful glance toward the small knot of people gathered near the tombola stall. At the center stood Mrs. Constance Blackwood, the village's most formidable widow, her sharp features animated with the particular intensity she reserved for matters of moral indignation. Her audience consisted of the usual suspects: Miss Prudence Weatherby, whose devotion to Mrs. Blackwood bordered on the religious, and Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell, the church treasurer, whose nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles had become more pronounced in recent weeks. "The new vicar seems to have stirred up quite a hornet's nest," Mrs. Bantry continued in a lower voice. "All those modern ideas about the service, and now this business with the church funds." Reverend Michael Ashford's arrival 3 months earlier had created ripples that were still spreading through the placid waters of village life. The young clergyman, recently arrived from London with impeccable credentials and progressive ideas, was currently attempting to manage both the ring toss and a heated discussion about the placement of the cake table. His predecessor, dear old Canon Pennyfather, had possessed the rare gift of appearing serenely in control even when chaos reigned. This younger man, despite his obvious dedication, seemed somewhat overwhelmed by the intricacies of parish politics. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a figure standing apart from the main crowd. Mr. Alistair Thorpe, the retired colonial administrator who had purchased the Grange the previous year, surveyed the festivities with his customary air of detached disdain. His recent decision to block the ancient footpath that had crossed his property for generations had made him decidedly unpopular, and his presence at village gatherings was tolerated rather than welcomed. "I see Mr. Thorpe has honored us with his presence," murmured Mrs. Bantry. "One might have thought he'd stay away, given the feeling about that footpath business." Miss Marple observed the way conversation seemed to falter when Thorpe moved within earshot, how young Timothy Marsh, the church organist, kept glancing nervously in his direction while pretending to arrange sheet music. There was something almost theatrical about the man's isolation, as if he were deliberately courting unpopularity. Near the refreshment tent, she noticed Dr. Sarah Fleming, the village's newest resident, engaged in animated conversation with Colonel Weatherby. The young doctor had integrated herself into village life with remarkable ease, though Miss Marple had noted the way certain conversations ceased when she approached the natural wariness of a small community toward newcomers, however charming. A burst of laughter from the croquet lawn provided a welcome counterpoint to the underlying tensions. The vicar's sister, Miss Eleanor Ashford, was attempting to explain the rules to a group of children, genuine delight in their company evident to all. She had arrived from London to keep house for her brother, bringing with her a refreshing lack of concern for village protocol that had initially shocked and gradually charmed the community. "Jane, you're looking remarkably thoughtful," observed Mrs. Bantry with a knowing smile. "I do hope you're not detecting mysteries where none exist." Before Miss Marple could reply, a sharp cry suddenly pierced the pleasant afternoon chatter. The sound came from the direction of the secluded rose garden, where the vicar's prized specimens bloomed in magnificent profusion behind a low hedge. Heads turned throughout the garden, conversations faltering as the cry was followed by an ominous silence. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care, her keen eyes already noting the varied reactions around her. Genuine alarm, curious excitement, and on one or two faces, something that might have been calculation rather than surprise. Reverend Ashford emerged from behind the rose hedge, his face drained of color, one trembling hand pressed to his mouth. Behind him, the small group that had rushed to investigate stood frozen in horrified silence. "It's Mr. Thorpe," someone whispered, the words carrying clearly in the sudden hush. "He's dead." The peaceful afternoon in street. Mary Mead had taken a decidedly darker turn, and Miss Marple found herself wondering, not for the first time, how often the seeds of violence lay hidden beneath the most tranquil of surfaces. The transformation from garden party to crime scene occurred with the peculiar efficiency that small communities display in times of crisis. Within minutes, the cheerful marquees had emptied as villagers clustered in anxious groups, their voices creating a low hum of speculation that reminded Miss Marple of bees disturbed from their hive. Doctor Sarah Fleming had immediately taken charge, her professional training overriding any social awkwardness as she knelt beside Alistair, Thorpe's motionless form. Miss Marple, positioning herself strategically near the rose garden entrance, observed the doctor's careful examination with interest. The deceased lay crumpled beside a particularly magnificent specimen of climbing rose, his face bearing an expression of surprise rather than pain. "Heart attack, most likely, Doctor," Fleming announced, rising and brushing dirt from her skirt. "Though, of course, we'll need a proper post-mortem to be certain." Reverend Ashford nodded mutely, still visibly shaken by his discovery. His sister Eleanor appeared at his side, her earlier cheerfulness replaced by gentle concern as she guided him toward a garden bench. Miss Marple noted how the young woman's eyes swept the crowd, as if cataloging reactions. The arrival of Police Constable Williams brought official authority to the scene, though the young officer appeared somewhat overwhelmed. Miss Marple had observed him on previous occasions and found him well-meaning but lacking in the subtle understanding of human nature that such situations demanded. "Now then, everyone needs to stay calm," Williams announced, consulting his notebook. "Dr. Fleming, you've examined the deceased? Natural causes?" "It appears so, Constable, though a proper examination will be necessary." Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward with her customary authority. "Constable Williams, I think it's important you understand that Mr. Thorpe had been under considerable stress recently. The footpath dispute had created quite unpleasant feelings in the village. This observation prompted uncomfortable murmurs through the crowd. Miss Marple noted how several faces turned toward Timothy Marsh, whose opposition to the footpath closure had been particularly passionate during the recent parish council meeting. "Well, I can't say I'm entirely surprised," Blackwood continued, her voice carrying the satisfaction of vindicated predictions. "A man like that, living alone, never taking proper care of himself. The stress of all the unpleasantness, it's bound to take its toll." Miss Prudence Weatherby bobbed her head in vigorous agreement. "Exactly what I said yesterday. One could see it in his complexion." Colonel Weatherby appeared less convinced. "Seemed healthy enough when I saw him last week. Bit odd, him collapsing here of all places. Thorpe wasn't one for garden parties." Miss Marple filed this observation away with interest. Indeed, Thorpe's presence had struck several people as unusual, though no one had questioned it directly. Young Timothy Marsh stood apart from the main groups, his face pale as he attempted to light a cigarette with trembling hands. Miss Marple had noticed his nervous glances toward Thorpe throughout the afternoon. Geoffrey Hartwell engaged Dr. Fleming in urgent conversation, his usual nervousness amplified by circumstances. Miss Marple caught fragments, something about procedures and protocols delivered in his characteristic rapid-fire manner. The theories proliferated like weeds after rain. A disgruntled former employee, a rival from his business dealings, a local resident driven to desperate measures by the footpath dispute. Each theory revealed more about its proponent than about the deceased. "Poor Timothy," murmured Mrs. Bantry, following Miss Marple's gaze. "He's taken it rather hard." Miss Marple observed how the tragedy, like a stone dropped into still water, sent ripples through the carefully constructed facades of village life. People, when shocked, often revealed more of themselves than they intended. Mrs. Blackwood's judgment, Hartwell's anxieties, Timothy's distress, each offered a window into their relationship with the deceased. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple remained near the rose garden, her keen eyes taking in details others might overlook. Something about the scene troubled her, though she couldn't yet articulate precisely what. The positioning of the body, perhaps, or the curious absence of any sign of distress in Thorpe's final moments. Death, she reflected, rarely arrived with such convenient timing without reason. The arrival of Inspector Craddock from county headquarters the following morning transformed the vicarage garden from a scene of village speculation into something approaching an official investigation. Miss Marple had encountered the inspector on previous occasions and found him refreshingly free from the assumption that elderly ladies possessed neither observation skills nor useful insights. She positioned herself strategically on the vicarage terrace with her knitting, a vantage point that afforded an excellent view of the proceedings while appearing entirely innocent. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rose garden, where white tape now marked the boundaries of what had become, if not quite a crime scene, then certainly a place requiring official attention. Inspector Craddock's methodical examination of the scene proved thorough. His attention focused particularly on the positioning of where Thorpe had been found. Fleming. Noting the young doctor's professional gestures and occasional frowns of uncertainty, the interviews began with Reverend Ashford, who emerged looking considerably more composed than he had the previous afternoon. His account was precise and dispassionate, perhaps too much so, Miss Marple reflected. The young vicar described his discovery with clinical detachment, mentioning only that he had been taking a shortcut through the rose garden when he found the body. Dr. Fleming's session with the inspector proved particularly interesting. While maintaining her initial assessment of natural causes, Miss Marple detected a subtle emphasis when the doctor stressed the need for a complete post-mortem examination. The phrase suggested professional caution rather than complete certainty. Timothy Marsh's interview lasted considerably longer than the others. When he finally emerged, his face was flushed and his hands trembling as he fumbled for his cigarettes. Miss Marple noted how he avoided eye contact with the small group of villagers gathered near the church gate. His emotional state remained transparently distressed, too raw and genuine, she thought, for the calculated performance of a guilty conscience. Mrs. Blackwood, not to be excluded from any significant event, offered her unsolicited opinions with characteristic authority. "The stress of that footpath business," she declared to anyone within earshot. "It weighed heavily on him, mark my words." Her pointed glances toward Timothy suggested where she believed official suspicion should fall. Geoffrey Hartwell appeared more concerned with procedural disruptions than the death itself. He stammered to Colonel Weatherby, adjusting his spectacles nervously. "We can't simply abandon our responsibilities to the charities." His anxiety seemed focused on ledgers and balance sheets, rather than human tragedy. During a quiet moment, Miss Marple made her own careful observation of the rose garden. The police photographer had finished his work, leaving her free to notice details that others might overlook. Near where Thorpe's hand had lain, a single rose stem lay broken on the gravel path, freshly snapped, not withered. For a man who tended his roses with obsessive care, it seemed an odd detail. More curious still was the absence of the heavy rose fragrance that typically perfumed that section of the garden. Despite the profusion of blooms, the air seemed strangely muted, almost sterile. Miss Marple trusted her senses. Such small anomalies often revealed more than obvious evidence. As the official investigation concluded, Inspector Craddock's expression carried the satisfaction of a man who had found nothing to contradict the obvious explanation. Yet Miss Marple detected undercurrents in the village that hadn't existed before Thorpe's death. Conversations ceased more abruptly when others approached. Glances carried calculation rather than mere curiosity. Eleanor Ashford joined her on the terrace as the inspector departed. "Poor Timothy seems quite overwrought," she observed, "though I suppose it's natural, given his passionate feelings about the footpath dispute." "His feelings?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Oh yes, something about his grandmother's cottage and the path being part of the village heritage. Rather touching, really, though Mr. Thorpe remained quite unmoved." Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. Family connections and inherited grievances often provided motives that appeared disproportionate to outsiders, but felt entirely justified to those involved. As the morning settled into routine, she reflected that whatever had brought Alistair Thorpe to yesterday's garden party, and whatever had ended his life beside those carefully tended roses, the effects continued rippling through the community, like stones cast into still water. By Wednesday morning, the village had settled into the comfortable certainty that comes when complex events arrange themselves into familiar patterns. Timothy Marsh, with his passionate temperament and public grievances against the deceased, provided exactly the sort of suspect that satisfied both logic and local prejudices. Inspector Craddock's methodical approach had uncovered several pieces of evidence that seemed to support this theory. During his search of the garden party area, a crumpled note had been discovered near the tombola stall, bearing the printed heading, "Save Our Path," and on the reverse, words scrawled in block capitals, "You won't stop us here." While not explicitly threatening, the message carried an unmistakable undertone of confrontation. More intriguing still was Timothy's own inadvertent contribution to the case. When summoned for his second interview, the young man had nervously produced a silver lighter bearing an engraved Crest Thorpe's lighter, found on the grass after the garden party's chaotic conclusion. "I meant to give it to Constable Williams," Timothy stammered, his hands trembling as he placed the object on the vicarage desk. "Everything happened so quickly, and then with all the questions." Inspector Craddock examined the lighter with professional interest. Its presence near the scene, combined with Timothy's failure to report finding it immediately, added another layer of circumstantial evidence to an already compelling case. The interview itself revealed a young man under considerable strain. Timothy's account remained consistent. He had approached Thorpe near the rose garden to make one final appeal about the footpath, been dismissed with what he termed insulting indifference, and then retreated to the church to check the hymn board. Yet his emotional state during the questioning suggested someone grappling with more than mere grief over a neighbor's death. "Mr. Thorpe called me sentimental," Timothy repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "Said the path meant nothing, that progress required difficult decisions. But it wasn't just a path, Inspector. It was my grandmother's daily walk, the village's heritage." How could he not understand that? Mrs. Blackwood, ever ready to provide authoritative commentary, held court outside the post office as news of these developments spread. "The evidence speaks for itself," she declared to her assembled audience. "A threatening note, possession of the deceased's property, and that dreadful confrontation witnessed by half the village. Poor Timothy has clearly been overwhelmed by his emotions." Miss Prudence Weatherby nodded vigorously. One could see the anger building in him during the parish council meetings. "Such intensity cannot be healthy." Eleanor Ashford provided the day's most spirited defense of the accused. "It's absolutely preposterous," she declared, her cheeks flushed with indignation. "The gentlest souls in the village. His passion for preserving local heritage hardly makes him a murderer." Her brother, however, maintained diplomatic silence on the subject, though his troubled expression whenever Timothy's name arose suggested internal conflict between pastoral duty and growing suspicion. Miss Marple, observing these developments with characteristic quiet attention, found herself increasingly skeptical of the obvious conclusion. That afternoon, she made her way to Timothy's cottage, ostensibly to return a borrowed hymnal. The young man who answered her knock appeared haggard and defeated, his usual neat appearance giving way to rumpled clothes and hollow eyes. Miss Marple noted details that others might overlook. The carefully maintained photographs of his grandmother, sheet music arranged with obsessive precision, and a small garden visible through the back window, where marigolds struggled against encroaching weeds, a poignant reminder of inherited responsibilities and fading connections to the past. Such dedication to family memory is admirable. Timothy's response revealed more about his character than hours of official questioning. She used to say the path connected more than places, it connected generations. Thorpe saw only property lines and profit margins. As Miss Marple walked home through the village, she reflected on the dangerous appeal of obvious solutions. Timothy Marsh possessed motive, opportunity, and a temperament that made guilt plausible. Yet something in his genuine anguish struck her as inconsistent with calculated murder. True guilt, in her extensive experience, often manifested differently than raw grief and bewildered shock. The question that troubled her most was not whether Timothy could have killed Alistair Thorpe, but whether someone else had found in the young man's public opposition the perfect shield for their own darker purposes. Fleming's announcement regarding the post-mortem brought a peculiar stillness to the village, as if the very air held its breath awaiting official confirmation of what many had begun to suspect. Miss Marple, never one to remain idle during times of uncertainty, made her way to the vicarage under the perfectly reasonable pretext of helping Eleanor Ashford sort through the remaining detritus of the garden party. The parish hall presented a scene of genteel chaos. Bunting tangled in colorful skeins, empty jam jars with their labels curling damply at the edges, and a collection of hand-lettered signs propped against various chairs. Eleanor moved through the debris with determined efficiency, though Miss Marple noted a certain tension in her movements that hadn't been present during their previous encounters. "How thoughtful of you to help," Eleanor said, pushing back a strand of hair with a chalk-dusted hand. "Michael insists we must have everything cleared before the Mothers' Union meeting this afternoon." Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the collection of signs scattered about the room. Each bore Eleanor's distinctive handwriting, bold, rounded letters with a particular flourish to the downstrokes. "You have such a clear hand, my dear," she observed, examining a sign reading Tombola with its characteristic looped letters. "I've always enjoyed making notices," Eleanor replied, though her voice carried less enthusiasm than her words suggested. "In London, everything goes to professional printers, so impersonal." As they worked, Miss Marple's keen eyes catalogued the various papers and cards. Near the bottom of a box containing bunting, she discovered a small piece of card bearing the penciled letters UW before the line broke off abruptly. The writing was in block capitals, pressed hard into the paper, with that same distinctive hook at the end of downstrokes that characterized Eleanor's other work. The discovery might have meant nothing to a casual observer, but Miss Marple recalled with perfect clarity the threatening note found near the tombola stall. "You won't stop us here." The similarity in handwriting style was unmistakable to someone who had spent decades observing the small details that revealed human nature. "Eleanor, dear," Miss Marple said casually. "Would you mind if I used this scrap of card as packing material? It would prevent the jam jars from rattling." "Of course," Eleanor replied, though Miss Marple detected a slight hesitation. "It's only waste paper." Later that morning, Miss Marple made her way to the church, where she had volunteered to check the flower arrangements. Mrs. Pemberton's work, as always, displayed seasonal competence, but something about the altar flowers caught her attention. Among the white roses, clearly cut from the vicarage garden, several specimens showed signs of hasty trimming, their stems bearing the ragged cuts of hurried shears rather than the clean angles of careful gardening. More intriguing still was the subtle but unmistakable fragrance that clung to these particular blooms. Beneath the natural rose scent lay something else, a faint medicinal odor that reminded her of the nursing home, where she occasionally visited elderly parishioners. The scent was barely perceptible, certainly nothing that would alarm casual observers, but Miss Marple's experienced senses had been sharpened by decades of careful attention to seemingly insignificant details. Her contemplation was interrupted by Mrs. Pemberton herself, who entered with fresh water for the vases. "Such a shame about those lovely roses," she confided, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "When I went to cut flowers for Sunday's arrangement, I found several of the best specimens had already been taken. Quite freshly cut, too, the stems were still weeping sap." "How curious," Miss Marple murmured. "Did Reverend Ashford mention cutting them?" "That's just it. He seemed as surprised as I was. Said he hadn't touched them, and Eleanor certainly claims to know nothing about gardening." Mrs. Pemberton's expression grew thoughtful. "Rather odd timing, wouldn't you say? The very morning after poor Mr. Thorpe's passing." This information proved particularly significant when considered alongside Miss Marple's earlier observations. During her visit to the vicarage, she had noticed several botanical reference books in Eleanor's sitting room, their pages well thumbed and marked with careful annotations. The disparity between claimed ignorance and evident knowledge suggested deliberate deception. That evening, as she tended her own small garden, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern emerging from these seemingly disconnected observations. The broken rose stem she had noticed near where Thorpe's body was found took on new significance. Had it been a clean break, as she now suspected, rather than the jagged tear of an accidental fall? Someone with botanical knowledge had cut roses from the vicarage garden on the morning after Thorpe's death, roses that now carried a faint but distinct medicinal odor. Most troubling of all was the growing certainty that Timothy Marsh, despite all circumstantial evidence pointing toward his guilt, was serving as an unwitting shield for someone far more calculating, someone who understood that the most effective deceptions often relied on allowing others to reach obvious but incorrect conclusions. The confirmation that Alistair Thorpe had died from digitalis poisoning rather than natural causes sent tremors through the village that no amount of determined normalcy could suppress. Fleming's carefully worded report to Inspector Craddock that significant levels of cardiac glycosides consistent with foxglove had been found in the deceased's system transformed comfortable speculation into genuine alarm. Miss Marple, maintaining her customary position of helpful invisibility, observed the varied reactions as news spread through the intricate network of village communication. The revelation demanded that people examine not merely their whereabouts during the garden party, but their knowledge, their relationships, and their carefully guarded secrets. Blackwood's immediate response was to convene an emergency gathering at her cottage, where she presided with the grim satisfaction of someone whose dire predictions had been vindicated. "Poison," she declared to her assembled audience, her voice carrying the authority of confirmed prophecy. "I said from the beginning that all this unpleasantness would lead to tragedy. This confirms everything we suspected about young Timothy's unstable condition." Yet even as she spoke, Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Blackwood's certainty seemed to require constant reinforcement, as if she were convincing herself as much as her listeners. The widow's need to control the narrative suggested someone working hard to direct attention away from other possibilities. Geoffrey Hartwell's nervous energy had escalated beyond mere anxiety into something approaching panic. When Miss Marple encountered him in the church vestry, ostensibly to discuss flower fund arrangements, she found him pacing with jerky movements, his spectacles requiring constant adjustment as perspiration made them slip. "This changes everything about the parish finances," he stammered, his hands trembling as he gestured toward his ledgers. "If there's been murder in the vicarage garden, the bishop will demand a complete audit. The publicity alone could destroy our fundraising efforts for the roof repairs." His distress seemed curiously focused on administrative concerns, though Miss Marple detected deeper currents beneath his obvious agitation. When she gently inquired about Mr. Thorpe's recent contributions to church funds, Hartwell's composure cracked entirely. "Calculating," Hartwell blurted, then immediately looked stricken at his own words. Mr. Thorpe preferred investments to donations. He had considerable sums tied up in various parish projects, but always with conditions that gave him oversight authority. His voice dropped to a whisper. "He found discrepancies in my bookkeeping minor errors, really, but he made them sound like deliberate fraud. At the garden party, he demanded I hand over documents proving my competence." The image of Hartwell passing an envelope to Thorpe behind the tea tent suddenly acquired sinister significance. Had the church treasurer been paying blackmail to prevent exposure of financial irregularities? Eleanor Ashford's reaction to the poison revelation proved equally illuminating. When Miss Marple visited the vicarage under the pretext of returning borrowed hymn books, she found Eleanor arranging flowers with movements that seemed carefully controlled rather than naturally graceful. "Such a terrible business," Eleanor murmured, not looking up from her work. "Though I suppose it explains why poor Timothy seemed so agitated. The strain of knowing someone had been murdered must have been overwhelming." Miss Marple observed Eleanor's technique, with the flower stem's precise cuts that spoke of extensive experience despite her repeated claims of botanical ignorance. "You have such a sure hand with flowers, my dear. Those botanical reference books in your sitting room must have been helpful." Eleanor's hands stilled for just a moment. "Oh, those belonged to Michael. He had a brief fascination with horticulture at university, though it never quite developed into serious study." The explanation felt rehearsed, particularly when Miss Marple recalled the careful annotations and well-thumbed pages that suggested intensive study rather than casual interest. More telling still was Eleanor's unconscious demonstration of plant knowledge as she worked, selecting stems and arranging blooms with the confidence of someone thoroughly familiar with botanical principles. Dr. Fleming provided the afternoon's most unexpected revelation when Miss Marple encountered her outside the surgery. The young doctor's professional composure had given way to obvious distress over Timothy's arrest. "It's absolutely preposterous," Dr. Fleming declared, with uncharacteristic vehemence. "Timothy couldn't extract cardiac glycosides from foxgloves if his life depended on it. That level of botanical chemistry requires specialized knowledge." Miss Marple's gentle inquiry about such specialized knowledge prompted an inadvertent confession. "I worked briefly under Dr. Alistair Thorpe, the deceased's nephew, at a London research hospital. Brilliant man, but absolutely ruthless about professional standards. When he discovered I'd made an error in a research grant application, he not only terminated my position but ensured I couldn't secure another research post in London." The personal connection between Dr. Fleming and the Thorpe family cast her involvement in an entirely different light. Had professional revenge motivated her careful attention to the post-mortem findings? As evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple made her way through the churchyard, where she encountered Timothy Marsh tending his grandmother's grave, with obsessive precision. The young man looked haggard, his usual neat appearance giving way to rumpled clothes and hollow eyes. "Timothy," she said gently, "this must be a terrible ordeal for you." He looked up with desperate gratitude at her kind tone. "Miss Marple, I keep thinking about that afternoon. Just before I found Mr. Thorpe, I saw someone near the rose garden, a woman in a green dress with a scarf pulled up over her hair. She moved like she didn't want to be noticed, but I only caught a glimpse." This observation proved particularly significant when Miss Marple recalled the various green garments worn at the garden party. Eleanor's leaf-colored frock, Dr. Fleming's darker emerald dress, and even Mrs. Pemberton's forest green cardigan. Yet movement, she knew from experience, was more individual than clothing. Some women walked to be admired, others to remain unobserved. Later that evening, as she sat in her cottage garden with her knitting, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern emerging from the day's revelations. 3 people now stood revealed as possessing both motive and means for Thorpe's murder. Hartwell, desperate to prevent financial exposure. Eleanor, whose botanical knowledge contradicted her innocent facade. And Dr. Fleming, carrying professional grievances that extended beyond her brief acquaintance with the deceased. Timothy Marsh remained in custody, his obvious anguish serving as a convenient focal point for official suspicion. Yet the more Miss Marple learned about the sophisticated nature of digitalis poisoning requiring botanical expertise, careful timing, and calculating intelligence, the more convinced she became that the real murderer possessed qualities the gentle young organist simply didn't demonstrate. Someone in their quiet village had committed murder with scientific precision, then skillfully allowed an innocent man to bear suspicion while they maintained their facade of respectability and concern. The question now was not who had the knowledge to extract poison from foxgloves, but who among those with such knowledge had found both opportunity and sufficient motivation to use it. The confirmation that Alistair Thorpe had died from digitalis poisoning rather than natural causes sent tremors through the village that no amount of determined normalcy could suppress. Dr. Fleming's carefully worded report to Inspector Craddock that significant levels of cardiac glycosides consistent with foxglove had been found in the deceased's system transformed comfortable speculation into genuine alarm. Miss Marple, maintaining her customary position of helpful invisibility, observed the varied reactions as news spread through the intricate network of village communication. The revelation demanded that people examine not merely their whereabouts during the garden party, but their knowledge, their relationships, and their carefully guarded secrets. Mrs. Blackwood's immediate response was to convene an emergency gathering at her cottage, where she presided with the grim satisfaction of someone whose dire predictions had been vindicated. "Poison," she declared to her assembled audience, her voice carrying the authority of confirmed prophecy. "I said from the beginning that all this unpleasantness would lead to tragedy. This confirms everything we suspected about young Timothy's unstable condition." Geoffrey Hartwell's nervous energy had escalated beyond mere anxiety into something approaching panic. When Miss Marple encountered him in the church vestry, she found him pacing with jerky movements, his spectacles requiring constant adjustment as perspiration made them slip. "Changes everything about the parish finances," he stammered, his hands trembling as he gestured toward his ledgers. "If there's been murder in the vicarage garden, the bishop will demand a complete audit. The publicity alone could destroy our fundraising efforts." His distress seemed curiously focused on administrative concerns, though Miss Marple detected deeper currents beneath his obvious agitation. When she gently inquired about Mr. Thorpe's recent contributions to church funds, Hartwell's composure cracked entirely. "He wasn't generous, he was calculating," Hartwell blurted, then immediately looked stricken at his own words. "Mr. Thorpe preferred investments to donations, always with conditions that gave him oversight authority. He found discrepancies in my bookkeeping and made them sound like deliberate fraud. At the garden party, he demanded I hand over documents proving my competence. The image of Hartwell passing an envelope to Thorpe behind the tea tent suddenly acquired sinister significance. Eleanor Ashford's reaction to the poison revelation proved equally illuminating. When Miss Marple visited the vicarage under the pretext of returning borrowed hymn books, she found Eleanor arranging flowers with movements that seemed carefully controlled, rather than naturally graceful. "Such a terrible business," Eleanor murmured, not looking up from her work, though I suppose it explains why poor Timothy seemed so agitated. Miss Marple observed Eleanor's technique with the flower stems' precise cuts that spoke of extensive experience despite her repeated claims of botanical ignorance. "You have such a sure hand with flowers, my dear. Those botanical reference books in your sitting room must have been helpful." Eleanor's hands stilled for just a moment. "Oh, those belonged to Michael. He had a brief fascination with horticulture at university, though it never quite developed into serious study." The explanation felt rehearsed, particularly when Miss Marple recalled the careful annotations and well-thumbed pages that suggested intensive study rather than casual interest. Fleming provided the afternoon's most unexpected revelation when Miss Marple encountered her outside the surgery. The young doctor's professional composure had given way to obvious distress over Timothy's arrest. "It's absolutely preposterous," Dr. Fleming declared with uncharacteristic vehemence. "Timothy couldn't extract cardiac glycosides from foxgloves if his life depended on it. That level of botanical chemistry requires specialized knowledge." Miss Marple's gentle inquiry about such specialized knowledge prompted an inadvertent confession. I worked briefly under Dr. Alistair Thorpe, the deceased's nephew, at a London research hospital. When he discovered I'd made an error in a research grant application, he not only terminated my position but ensured I couldn't secure another research post in London. The personal connection between Dr. Fleming and the Thorpe family cast her involvement in an entirely different light. As evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple encountered Timothy Marsh in the churchyard, where the young man looked haggard and desperate. "Miss Marple," he confided, "just before I found Mr. Thorpe, I saw someone near the rose garden, a woman in a green dress with a scarf pulled up over her hair. She moved like she didn't want to be noticed, but I only caught a glimpse." This observation proved particularly significant when Miss Marple recalled the various green garments worn at the garden party: Eleanor's leaf-colored frock, Dr. Fleming's darker emerald dress, and Mrs. Pemberton's forest green cardigan. As she sat in her cottage garden that evening, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern emerging from the day's revelations. 3 people now stood revealed as possessing both motive and means for Thorpe's murder: Hartwell, desperate to prevent financial exposure; Eleanor, whose botanical knowledge contradicted her innocent facade; and Dr. Fleming, carrying professional grievances that extended beyond her brief acquaintance with the deceased. Someone in their quiet village had committed murder with scientific precision, then skillfully allowed an innocent man to bear suspicion while they maintained their facade of respectability and concern. The Mothers' Union meeting proceeded with the determined normalcy that village organizations employ when confronted with unpleasant circumstances. The parish hall bore its familiar sense of beeswax and damp wool, while Mrs. Blackwood presided with her customary authority over an assembly that seemed smaller and more subdued than usual. Miss Marple positioned herself near the wall with her knitting, observing how the recent events had altered the subtle dynamics of village interaction. Conversations felt more guarded, glances more calculating, as if everyone were reassessing their neighbors through the lens of recent revelations. Eleanor Ashford moved among the assembled ladies with practiced efficiency, arranging cups and saucers with movements that appeared composed but carried an underlying tension. Her brother hovered near the door, pale and drawn, his clerical duties weighing heavily upon him since the investigation had begun. Geoffrey Hartwell arrived midway through the proceedings, perspiring despite the cool afternoon and clutching his leather case as if it contained his salvation. His nervous energy had escalated beyond mere anxiety into something approaching desperation. "Forgive the interruption," he stammered, adjusting his spectacles with trembling fingers. "I need to secure this week's receipts in the vestry safe, with all the recent—" "One cannot be too careful with parish funds." Eleanor immediately offered assistance. "I can fetch them for you, Mr. Hartwell. The vestry key is readily available." "No, no," Hartwell protested, already fumbling with his key ring. "I have my own access. Best to handle these matters personally." He disappeared through the side door leading to the church passage, returning several minutes later with his case properly secured and, oddly, a small glass of amber liquid that caught the weak afternoon light. "Medicinal purposes," he explained to Mrs. Blackwood's disapproving expression. "The strain has been considerable. Old Canon Pennyfather always kept a decanter for pastoral emergencies." Fleming, who had agreed to speak about first aid preparations, turned with professional interest as Hartwell sipped the liquid and immediately grimaced. "How curious," he murmured. "The sherry tastes remarkably bitter today, almost medicinal itself." Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled as she observed Hartwell's increasingly erratic behavior. His pupils appeared dilated, and he kept blinking rapidly as if the room's lighting had suddenly changed character. "The lamps," he said wonderingly. "They seem to have golden halos. Most extraordinary." His voice carried a dreamlike quality that sent alarm through Miss Marple's experienced mind. Dr. Fleming crossed the room with swift efficiency, her fingers finding Hartwell's wrist. "Your pulse is irregular and slow," she announced. "Mr. Hartwell, put down that glass immediately. Has anyone else consumed any of that sherry?" "Only myself," he whispered, his face draining of color. "I thought. Just a small amount to steady the nerves." "Ambulance, doctor," Fleming commanded. "Now, and nobody touch that decanter." As Constable Williams rushed to telephone for emergency services, Miss Marple made her way quietly through the side door into the church's cool interior. The vestry revealed several disturbing details. The sherry decanter bore a faint crystalline residue around its rim, and a small spoon nearby glistened with a tacky substance that was decidedly not sherry. More intriguing was the key ring hanging on the door peg bearing a small medallion of Street Michael that she distinctly remembered seeing, attached to Eleanor's reticule during the garden party. The hearth showed signs of recent use, with blackened paper fragments in the ash and what appeared to be melted sealing wax. When she returned to the hall, Inspector Craddock had arrived and was questioning the assembled group with renewed intensity. The second poisoning attempt had shattered any comfortable assumptions about the case's resolution. "This changes everything," he announced grimly. "We're clearly dealing with someone who remains active and increasingly desperate." While expressing appropriate shock, Miss Marple detected a subtle shift in her demeanor, a calculation behind the concern that suggested someone rapidly reassessing their position. As the ambulance departed with Hartwell, "Doctor," Fleming made a disturbing observation. "Inspector, the symptoms Mr. Hartwell displayed, the visual disturbances, the cardiac irregularities, they're consistent with digitalis poisoning. Someone has attempted the same method twice." Mrs. Blackwood's authoritative voice carried a new uncertainty. "But surely this proves Timothy's innocence? He's been in custody since yesterday." "Indeed it does," Inspector Craddock replied, "which means our real perpetrator has been moving freely among us, using Mr. Marsh as convenient cover for their activities." Miss Marple reflected on the evening's revelations as the village dispersed in shocked silence. The killer had grown bold enough to attempt a second murder, but had they also grown careless? The evidence in the vestry suggested someone with intimate knowledge of church routines and access to secured areas. More troubling still was the implication that Alistair Thorpe's death had been merely the first step in a larger plan. Someone in their quiet community possessed not only the botanical knowledge to extract deadly poison from common garden plants, but the calculated ruthlessness to eliminate anyone who threatened their carefully constructed facade. The shadow over the vicarage garden had deepened considerably, and Miss Marple found herself wondering how many more secrets lay buried beneath the village's placid surface and how far someone would go to keep them hidden. The morning following Geoffrey Hartwell's hospitalization brought an unsettling quiet to the village, as if the very air held its breath awaiting further revelations. Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage with deliberate purpose, her knitting bag containing several carefully selected items that would serve as instruments in her final examination of the truth. She carried a small posy of garden flowers, pinks, lavender, and nestled innocently among them, a spire of foxglove with its distinctive purple bells, nodding as if with secret knowledge. In her extensive experience of human nature, Miss Marple had discovered that the right object, placed in the right setting, could prove more eloquent than any cross-examination. Eleanor Ashford received her in the morning room with gratitude that seemed almost too eager. Her movements carried a brisk efficiency that appeared at odds with the gravity of recent events, and Miss Marple noted how her eyes flickered briefly to the flowers before returning with a brightness that felt carefully arranged. "How thoughtful of you, Miss Marple," Eleanor said, settling the posy in a small vase. "Michael has been so distressed by these terrible events. The parish is in such turmoil." Miss Marple arranged herself comfortably with her knitting, allowing the silence to stretch just enough to become noticeable. Silence, she had long ago discovered, compelled people to fill it with the very thing they most wished to conceal. "Such dreadful talk there has been," Eleanor continued, her laugh meant to lighten the mood, but failing to do so. "At least poor Timothy will be exonerated now that Mr. Hartwell has been attacked as well." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly, her needles clicking rhythmically. "Though I confess I've been puzzling over some rather curious details. Yesterday evening, for instance, I found your Street Michael medallion in the vestry. Such an unusual place to leave it." Eleanor's hands stilled for just a moment as she poured tea. "I must have dropped it while helping with the flower arrangements. These old buildings have such uneven floors." Miss Marple produced the medallion from her knitting bag, its chain clearly broken at the clasp. "How fortunate that I found it. Though I'm afraid the chain will need repair." She examined the piece with apparent casualness. "Such beautiful workmanship. This particular design comes from Harrods, doesn't it? My niece has one remarkably similar." The observation struck home with precision. Eleanor's face flushed as she recognized the implication this was not a common religious token but an expensive piece that could be traced to specific purchases. "I've also been wondering," Miss Marple continued, conversationally, "about that charming handwriting on the garden party notices. Such a distinctive style. Those lovely loops on the downstrokes. The particular flourish to the letters. I noticed the same hand on a scrap of paper I found while helping clear the parish hall. U.W. it began, before breaking off. Rather curious, don't you think?" Eleanor set down her teacup with deliberate care, though Miss Marple detected a slight tremor in her fingers. "Many people write in block capitals for notices. It's hardly unique. Perhaps not unique in the abstract," Miss Marple conceded gently, "but in the particular, everything is unique, just as every plant has its own distinct properties." She adjusted the posy so that the foxglove tilted toward Eleanor's plate. "Take this lovely specimen. For instance, one could mistake it for campanula, you know. A pretty bell is a pretty bell." "Oh, not campanula," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. "Digital." She halted abruptly, the unfinished word hanging in the air like a thread snipped short. "I mean, well, one reads things." "Yes," said Miss Marple placidly. "One remembers, too, especially when one has made such careful study of botanical texts. Your annotations in those reference books were quite thorough, particularly the detailed notes about cardiac glycosides and extraction methods." The kitchen fell silent except for the steady tick of the mantel clock. Eleanor's carefully maintained facade began to crack under Miss Marple's gentle but relentless pressure. And then there were those lovely white roses in the church. Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying no judgment. "Cut so freshly the morning after Mr. Thorpe's death, though they had such a curious scent, rather medicinal, I thought. Mrs. Pemberton was quite surprised to find several of the best specimens had already been taken from the vicarage garden. Eleanor's composure shattered like fine china dropped on stone. Her face crumpled, and tears began streaming down her cheeks as the weight of her carefully constructed deception finally became unbearable. "You must understand," she whispered, her voice choked with desperation. "Everything I did was for Michael's sake. That dreadful man was systematically destroying him, threatening to expose old scandals from his previous parish. There had been a young woman, a parishioner who became too attached. Nothing improper happened, but her accusations nearly ruined him. We came here for a fresh start, but Thorpe had connections everywhere." The confession poured out in a torrent of justification and anguish. Thorpe had demanded control over parish decisions, influence over church funds, and assurance that all village disputes would be resolved in his favor. The garden party had been intended as his public declaration of victory over local opposition. "I studied those botanical texts for months," Eleanor continued, her hands trembling, "learning exactly how to extract and concentrate digitalis from the foxgloves in our own garden. I prepared everything in the garden shed, then disposed of the evidence by cutting fresh flowers for the church arrangements. The roses provided perfect cover." Miss Marple's gentle voice encouraged the complete revelation. "And poor Mr. Hartwell discovered your activities? He saw me in the vestry that evening, burning the last of my notes and equipment. He recognized the smell from his late wife's heart medication. I couldn't risk him putting the pieces together, so I added the poison to Canon Pennyfather's old sherry decanter. I thought if he became ill, it would seem like another random attack, and suspicion would remain focused on Timothy." Eleanor's confession revealed the calculating intelligence behind what had appeared to be crimes of passion. The threatening note had been deliberately crafted to implicate Timothy, using knowledge of his passionate opposition to the footpath closure. Even her presence at the garden party had been carefully orchestrated to ensure she could administer the poison and establish her alibi simultaneously. As Inspector Craddock's footsteps approached on the garden path, summoned by Miss Marple's carefully timed telephone call, Eleanor Ashford's desperate gamble to protect her brother's reputation crumbled into the ruins of multiple lives destroyed by her misguided loyalty. The gentle clicking of knitting needles had once again accompanied the unraveling of a murderer's carefully constructed deception, proving that the most dangerous criminals often wore the most innocent faces and justified their actions with the noblest intentions. The morning following Geoffrey Hartwell's hospitalization brought unsettling quiet to the village. Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage with deliberate purpose, her knitting bag containing carefully selected items for her final examination of the truth. She carried a small posy of garden flowers, pinks, lavender, and nestled among them a spire of foxglove with distinctive purple bells nodding as if with secret knowledge. In her experience, the right object placed strategically could prove more eloquent than cross-examination. Eleanor Ashford received her with gratitude that seemed too eager, her movements carrying efficiency at odds with recent events' gravity. Miss Marple noted how Eleanor's eyes flickered to the flowers before returning with carefully arranged brightness. "How thoughtful, Miss Marple," Eleanor said, settling the posy in a vase. Michael has been so distressed by these terrible events. Miss Marple arranged herself comfortably, allowing silence to stretch until it became noticeable. Silence compelled people to fill it with what they most wished to conceal. At least poor Timothy will be exonerated now, Eleanor continued nervously. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, needles clicking rhythmically. Though I've been puzzling over curious details. Yesterday evening, I found your street Michael medallion in the vestry. Such an unusual place to leave it. Eleanor's hands stilled momentarily. I must have dropped it helping with flower arrangements. Miss Marple produced the medallion, its chain clearly broken. How fortunate I found it. This particular Herod's design is quite distinctive. My niece has one remarkably similar. The observation struck precisely. Eleanor flushed, recognizing the implication of a traceable, expensive piece. I've also wondered about that charming handwriting on garden party notices, Miss Marple continued conversationally. Such distinctive loops and flourishes. I noticed the same hand on a scrap reading UW before breaking off. Rather curious. Eleanor set down her teacup carefully. Many people write in block capitals. Perhaps, but everything is unique in the particular, like plants with distinct properties. Miss Marple adjusted the posy so foxglove tilted toward Eleanor's plate. One could mistake this for campanula. Pretty bells are pretty bells. Oh, not campanula, Eleanor said reflexively. Digital. She halted abruptly. I mean, one reads things. Yes, one remembers too, especially after careful study of botanical texts. Your annotations about cardiac glycosides were quite thorough. Eleanor's facade began cracking under Miss Marple's gentle pressure. And those church roses, cut so freshly after Mr. Thorpe's death, with their curious medicinal scent. Pemberton was surprised to find specimens already taken from the vicarage garden. Eleanor's composure shattered completely. Tears streamed as her deception became unbearable. You must understand, she whispered desperately. Everything was for Michael's sake. That man was destroying him, threatening to expose old scandals from his previous parish. A young parishioner had made accusations. Nothing improper happened, but it nearly ruined him. Thorpe had connections everywhere. The confession poured out. Thorpe had demanded control over parish decisions and church funds. Eleanor had studied botanical texts for months, learning to extract digitalis from garden foxgloves, preparing everything in the garden shed, then disposing of evidence through church flower arrangements. And Mr. Hartwell? Miss Marple prompted gently. He saw me burning notes in the vestry, recognized the smell from his wife's heart medication. I couldn't risk him connecting the pieces, so I poisoned Canon Pennyfather's old sherry. I thought it would seem like another random attack. Eleanor's confession revealed calculating intelligence behind apparent crimes of passion. The threatening note had deliberately implicated Timothy, using his passionate opposition to the footpath closure. As Inspector Craddock's footsteps approached, summoned by Miss Marple's carefully timed call, Eleanor Ashford's desperate gamble crumbled into ruins of multiple lives, destroyed by misguided loyalty. The gentle clicking of knitting needles had once again accompanied a murderer's unraveling, proving the most dangerous criminals often wore innocent faces and justified actions with noble intentions. Inspector Craddock arrived at the vicarage drawing room to find a scene that spoke volumes before a word was uttered. Eleanor Ashford sat rigidly in her chair, tears having given way to the hollow composure of someone whose carefully constructed world had finally collapsed. Miss Marple occupied her usual position by the window, knitting needles still, her gentle eyes holding both sorrow and certainty. Reverend Michael Ashford stood behind his sister, his face bearing the particular devastation of a man discovering that love had taken a murderous form. Fleming waited near the mantelpiece, while Timothy Marsh, newly released and still bewildered, sat quietly by the door, finally understanding how completely he had been used. Inspector, Miss Marple began in her characteristically gentle manner. I believe Eleanor has something she wishes to tell you, though perhaps it would help if I explained how the pieces came together." She adjusted her spectacles with deliberate care. You see, from the very beginning, the case against poor Timothy felt rather too convenient. Digitalis poisoning requires not merely access to foxgloves, but precise knowledge of extraction and dosage. It is not a crime of passion, but of careful calculation. Miss Marple produced the small scrap of card from her knitting bag. My first real certainty came from this fragment, U.W., written in block capitals with those distinctive flourished downstrokes. The same hand that created all the garden party notices also wrote the threatening message found near the tombola stall. Eleanor, despite her claims of botanical ignorance, possessed extensive plant knowledge, as evidenced by the well-annotated reference books in her sitting room. Eleanor's voice emerged as barely a whisper. He was going to destroy Michael. Thorpe had discovered the scandal from his previous parish. A young parishioner who became obsessed, made accusations. Nothing improper happened, but Thorpe was going to use it to ruin Michael's career entirely. The method was ingenious in its simplicity, Miss Marple continued. Eleanor prepared a concentrated digitalis extract in the garden shed, then administered it to Mr. Thorpe during the garden party, most likely in a drink, given her position and access. The poison's delayed action allowed her to establish her presence elsewhere, before the symptoms manifested. Inspector Craddock leaned forward. And the disposal of evidence? Quite clever, really. Eleanor cut fresh roses from the vicarage garden the morning after the murder, using them for church arrangements. This explained both Mrs. Pemberton's surprise at finding specimens already taken and the faint medicinal scent I detected on those particular blooms. The broken rose stem near where Mr. Thorpe fell was actually a clean-cut evidence hastily disposed of at the scene. Fleming nodded grimly. The timing fits perfectly. Digitalis can take 30 minutes or more to produce cardiac symptoms, allowing the poisoner to be elsewhere when death occurred. Poor Mr. Hartwell's misfortune, Miss Marple observed sadly, was witnessing Eleanor burning evidence in the vestry. He recognized the medicinal smell from his late wife's heart medication. Eleanor, fearing exposure, poisoned Canon Pennyfather's old sherry decanter, knowing Geoffrey's nervous habits would lead him there. She produced the Broken Street Michael medallion. This confirmed Eleanor's presence in the vestry that evening. The chain broke as she hurried to complete her grim work. Everything I did was for Michael's sake. Thorpe was systematic in his destruction. He'd contacted the bishop, influential parishioners, even written to church publications. He wanted to demonstrate his power by utterly ruining my brother's reputation and ministry. Reverend Ashford's voice cracked with anguish. Eleanor, the scandal you sought to prevent was nothing compared to this. Whispered rumors could have been weathered. Murder cannot be undone. Miss Marple's needles clicked once, softly, then stilled. What troubles me most, my dear, is how completely you convinced yourself that murder was an act of love. The human capacity for self-deception in service of those we cherish is perhaps our most dangerous emotional failing. As Inspector Craddock prepared the formal arrest, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony before them. A sister's fierce love, expressed through calculated violence, had destroyed the very thing she sought to protect. The vicarage would never recover from this shadow, and Michael Ashford's ministry would forever bear the stain of Eleanor's desperate choices. The afternoon light streaming through the drawing-room windows seemed to mock the darkness that had been revealed, a reminder that evil often flourished in the most unlikely gardens, nurtured by the very virtues society held most dear: love, loyalty, and the desperate desire to protect those we cannot bear to lose. 3 weeks after Eleanor Ashford's arrest, Street Mary Mead had settled into the peculiar rhythm that follows great upheavals, a determined return to normalcy that carried the permanent weight of altered understanding. The autumn light fell differently now across familiar streets, as if the very air had been changed by the knowledge of what gentle hands could accomplish when guided by desperate love. Miss Marple made her customary morning walk through the village, observing with characteristic attention how the community was absorbing its harsh lesson about human nature. The vicarage stood empty, its windows reflecting the pale sky with blank indifference. Reverend Michael Ashford had requested immediate transfer to a distant parish, unable to continue his ministry in a place where his sister's fierce devotion had taken such a terrible form. The temporary vicar, an elderly gentleman borrowed from the neighboring parish, conducted Sunday services with competent efficiency, though his sermons lacked the passionate idealism that had marked his predecessor's brief tenure. The congregation had adjusted to this change, with the resilience of people who understood that some wounds required time to heal properly. Timothy Marsh had returned to his duties as church organist, his playing carrying a subdued quality that spoke of innocence lost rather than guilt absolved. His exoneration had brought relief, but not joy. The knowledge that he had been deliberately chosen as a scapegoat seemed to weigh upon him more heavily than the false accusation itself. "It changes how one sees people," he confided to Miss Marple after Sunday service, "knowing that someone I trusted could calculate so coldly how to destroy me, to protect herself. It makes one question every interaction." Miss Marple understood his disillusionment while recognizing its temporary nature. Time would restore his faith in human goodness, though perhaps with the harder-won wisdom that came from understanding human complexity. Geoffrey Hartwell had recovered from his poisoning, but remained deeply shaken by his narrow escape. The parish finances had never been more meticulously maintained, though his terror of making errors had rendered him almost paralyzed in his duties. The bishop's auditor had discovered not fraud, but unauthorized investments, speculative ventures, undertaken with the best intentions for the church roof fund. Dr. Fleming had thrown herself into her medical practice with renewed dedication, as if professional service could somehow balance the scales of her earlier silence about her connection to the Thorpe family. Her relationship with the village had deepened through shared trauma, transforming her from newcomer to trusted member of the community. Mrs. Blackwood maintained her position as the village's moral authority, though her certainty about Timothy's guilt had somewhat diminished her influence. She now offered her opinions with marginally less conviction, a development that several villagers found secretly refreshing. The most profound change had come over the village's understanding of itself. The comfortable assumption that they knew their neighbors, that evil announced itself with obvious signs, had been thoroughly shattered. Eleanor Ashford's gentle demeanor and devoted care for her brother had provided perfect camouflage for calculated murder. Miss Marple encountered Colonel Weatherby during her afternoon constitutional and found him unusually contemplative. "Makes one think," he observed, gesturing toward the empty vicarage. "All those years in the army, one learns to spot troublemakers. Yet I would have trusted that young woman with my life." "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "the lesson is not to become suspicious of everyone, but to remember that people are capable of both great good and terrible evil, often simultaneously." Eleanor's love for her brother was genuine. It was her expression of that love that became twisted. Later that evening, as she tended her own small garden, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern that had emerged from the tragedy. She paused before her foxgloves, their purple bells nodding in the gentle breeze, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Like the plants themselves, human nature contained both beauty and danger, tenderness and quiet cruelty. The village would continue, its routines restored, but the innocence, once lost, could never truly be regained. There would be harvest suppers and flower shows, quarrels about the church rota and celebrations of local victories. The footpath would remain open, and boots would wear the grass down to the old earth. connecting generations, as Timothy's grandmother had always believed. But beneath the surface tranquility, the residents of Street Mary Mead would carry the knowledge that love itself, when corrupted by fear and desperation, could become more dangerous than simple malice. The priest's shadow in the garden had been cast not by evil, but by devotion transformed into something unrecognizable and deadly, a reminder that understanding human nature required acknowledging both the nettles and the berries that grew in every heart.